Hello everyone. Just a quick preface. I'm mirroring this because I honestly hope that you will go over and check out a new channel called Infinite Progress. What they're doing over there I highly admire and value. They don't have hardly any subscribers yet, but I think we'll all be missing out if we don't watch what they're doing in the future and hopefully even get to participate. With that said, thanks to everyone involved, and for the viewer, I hope you enjoy.
Hey everybody, this is Landon. Welcome to another edition of Infinite Progress. Let's get into this. Well, I want to welcome everybody to this edition of Infinite Progress. And what we've tried to do in this series of discussions or dialogues or even debate is to position two competing worldviews addressing particular topics. And in this particular episode, we wanted to talk about emotions. And not just emotions, but the role that emotions play in developing a worldview. Now, this was interesting to me for three primary reasons. Number one was my own personal development. Moving from, as a teenager into my early 20s, from the atheist to an agnostic to a Christian. And the emotion that I felt as an atheist, kind of the emptiness, the nihilism, or the meaninglessness of life, and all the emotion that kind of went with that, moving to the Christian worldview, finding a little more purpose, significance, eternal value, things of that nature. Number two, though, ironically, the word of the year for 2016 from Oxford Dictionary, and for those that are interested, you could chase this down as it was covered in both the Washington Post and the New York Times. The word of the year for 2016 is post-truth. Now, specifically defined, post-truth is an adjective, quote, relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. Now, if I was to say that another way, basically, given the turbulent political season that we just had, most people were basing their decisions off of emotion or the emotional tug that was being presented there, and not so much the objective fact or the objective data. So that was the second reason. The third reason that I was really motivated by this stems from a 2004 PBS special called The Question of God. Now, this series or special was kind of birthed or influenced by the book with a similar title by Dr. Armand Nikolai. And basically in that book, Dr. Nikolai is addressing the question of God. And he's using Sigmund Freud and C.S. Lewis as kind of the models and how each of them address the big questions of life. Now, Dr. Nikolai had taught that course at Harvard and generally interacted with students on those questions. But in this PBS special, he had a panel representing different worldviews. And we're about to check out a clip where Dr. Mike Shermer, who is a very well-known, educated atheist, editor of Skeptic magazine, has spoken at Reason rallies, makes an interesting statement here. Let's check it out.
Number one, to the extent that people do have these religious or spiritual experiences, whether you call it an oceanic feeling or transcendent experience or some sense of connectedness, it's not clear, even if you label it spiritual, where that gets you.
For me, the scientific worldview generates that kind of feeling of transcendence. But an early experience, I suppose, would be Carl Sagan's Cosmos. I think Carl, more than anybody else, gave the feeling of the pure emotional awe and wonder and joy at the miracle of life, and the cosmos is so big and vast and grains of sand, and we're just one. And it certainly generates in me a feeling of spirituality. I feel like a spiritual person without a belief in God.
Were you agnostic before, or did you have a spiritual worldview and change from that to what you call a scientific? By a scientific worldview, I take it that you mean a secular worldview?
I mean a naturalism is my philosophy, that all all phenomena have natural explanations. There is no supernatural. There's just the natural and stuff we can't yet explain. That's basically my position. Socially, when I moved from theism to atheism and science as a worldview, I guess, to be honest, I just liked the people in science and the scientists and their books and just the lifestyle and the way of living. I liked that better than the religious books, the religious people I was hanging out with. Just socially, it just felt more comfortable for me.
A real clear,
no, it was,
one day here, one day here?
No, a couple of years with.
So it was a relationship-driven decision?
Not solely. But the intellectual stuff and all that's part of it. But if you're going to be honest, it's not just reasoning your way to a position.
Well, how do you make sense of the other now?
In reality, I think most of us arrive at most of our beliefs for non-rational reasons, and then we justify them with these reasons after the fact.
Well, as a psychiatrist, I think that we are primarily beings of feeling more than of thought. And I think that most of our decisions are often are made on the basis of what we feel instinctively. And so I wonder, in all of us, you know, how much of it we are influenced by people that we meet, whom we admire and want to be like.
Now, what I hope, or at least one of the things that I hoped you noticed in that clip, was what Dr. Shermer said as he changed his worldview from a more spiritual or Christian worldview. Now, he attended Pepperdine, which is a Church of Christ school, and he moved to a more secular atheist worldview and the role that emotion played in that. Now, that may have been surprising to some of you. Maybe not, but it possibly would have been surprising that an atheist would admit that. And also in that same clip, Dr. Armand Nikolai, who is not only a professor at Harvard, but a clinical psychiatrist and one who has more of a spiritual worldview, kind of affirmed that statement. Now, for those of you that are interested, just a couple book recommendations, more from a Christian perspective on this topic. A book by Dr. R.C. Sproul. Now, he has a teaching series on audio and video called The Psychology of Atheism, which is very interesting. And from a secular worldview perspective, this book by Dr. David Benatar, Better Never to Have Been. If you're an atheist or a skeptic, I would definitely encourage you to at least absorb that understanding of what the secular atheistic worldview leads to. David Benatar himself being an atheist. Now, what we've tried to do in today's discussion is to set up a panel to address this topic from two worldviews, the secular atheist and the Christian worldview. But within that, what we've hoped to do is have two individuals from each. And what we have is somebody who's basically had the atheist worldview their whole life. We have another individual that has had at one point in time a spiritual worldview or a desire to have a spiritual worldview, and then coming into a secular atheist worldview. And then we have an individual who's basically been a Christian their whole life, even though they had a conversion experience. They grew up in a Christian home and basically lived the Christian worldview. And then, of course, myself, that transitioned from atheism to Christianity. And so this panel represents not only two worldviews, but within that, the emotional consistency of maintaining that worldview and an emotional change, or at least the role that emotion played in that. Now, as you watch the following discussion, I guess keep in mind a couple things. Number one, just ask yourself while you're watching, which worldview best grounds or best explains the role that emotion plays? Also, consider a couple questions within the dialogue. Christopher Mowdy, for one, asked a really good question of the Christians that, as you're evangelizing, are you denying emotion while you're trying to present an objective historical gospel event? That's very interesting. Also keep in mind from the Christian perspective, as Trey asked the atheists, what do you do to challenge your worldview? What do you do to challenge your emotional commitments to your worldview? Also a very interesting question. So hopefully this is an informative and entertaining discussion, and enjoy. Well, hopefully everybody has enjoyed the little video clip there, and that will lead to our discussion tonight as we're going to talk about how worldviews, kind of two contrasting worldviews between a secular atheistic worldview and a spiritual and more specific Judeo-Christian worldview, address the topic of emotions and worldview. In what order do those go in? What role do emotions play in establishing a worldview? And tonight, out of our panel, I'm just going to let each of the individuals describe their own worldview in their own terms, and we'll get the discussion started. So, Christopher, go ahead and start us off, bud.
All right. So my name's Christopher Mowdy. I am an apatheist/atheist. On a good day, I really don't care about the question of whether a God exists. I'm more concerned with personal interactions and personal individual differences. But like if you were to ask me specifically about the great debate, I would have to label myself an atheist. So that's my worldview, and that's me.
All right, thank you, buddy. Ned.
Well, I've got a springboard on that. Only thing I would add is that I'm definitely from the naturalist camp. I think that in that video, what was mentioned was that I believe it was Shermer was saying, which I follow suit with, is that everything has a naturalistic explanation, and the things that don't, we haven't figured out yet. That's what I feel. That's kind of how I come from. I'm not a hardline atheist. I definitely feel I could be wrong, and for the most part, value being wrong. Most people know me at all know that I feel that the best way to learn something is to be open enough to being wrong, and then hoping to change if you were proven that way. So that's kind of me and my philosophy, I guess.
All right, thank you, buddy. Trey.
Thanks, Lennon. I'm a Reformed Christian, a Southern Baptist by denomination. Probably a theistic determinist from a philosophical perspective. And that's me.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, buddy. I kind of follow in suit, similar to Trey, Orthodox Reformed believer, member of Southern Baptist Convention, attach myself a little more to historicity of the history of Orthodoxy within the Christian faith. But in general, that's my worldview. And fellas, I wanted to kind of piggyback on top of the statement by Shermer by reading a few other quotes to kind of thicken the discussion a little bit or add a little bit more depth to it. Paul Johnson, in his book, Intellectuals, on page 69, states that it is a fact, and I quote, "It is a fact, and in some ways a melancholy fact, that massive works of the intellect do not spring from the abstract workings of the brain and the imagination. They are deeply rooted in the personality." I think that's an interesting way to put it. Obviously, Paul Johnson's work on intellectuals is kind of running through the time period from about Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and coming all the way down to contemporary times with Noam Chomsky. And he's chronicling secular thinkers and in terms of how they lived their life in conjunction with their worldview. And that was one of the conclusions he drew was, instead of I attribute to a certain worldview and then act accordingly, it seemed to be the other way. I have a certain lifestyle that I prefer, and I want to construct a worldview in order to reinforce that. That was Paul Johnson's point. A famous quote given by Aldous Huxley in his book Ends and Means. He said, quote, "I wanted to believe the Darwinian idea. I chose to believe it, not because I think there was enormous evidence for it, nor because I believe it had the full authority to give interpretation to my origins, but I chose to believe it because it delivered me from trying to find meaning and freed me to my own erotic passions." Dr. Shermer said elsewhere, "A belief in nothingness after death, the huge solace of thinking that for our betrayals, greed, cowardice, murders, we are not going to be judged." Thomas Nagel said, "I want atheism to be true. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that." To which Nagel confesses a cosmic authority problem in his book, The Last Word. And Richard Dawkins says in Blind Watchmaker on page 287, "Even if there was no actual evidence in favor of the Darwinian theory, we should still be justified in preferring it over all rival theories." So an interesting line of citations from secular and atheistic thinkers, guys, to kind of thicken this out a little bit. And so the opening question is primarily with what Mike Shermer and Dr. Nikolai had said in terms of establishing our worldview. Well, not necessarily establishing, I shouldn't say it that way. We make most of our decisions emotionally first and then reinforce them later with reason. Did you guys come to your worldview conclusions that way? Do you agree with that? Do you resonate with that? If so, why or why not? Christopher, start us off.
So I'm going to go ahead and just the short answer, the take-home point is yes for me. And if you're interested in a little bit more clarity about that, I'm not an atheist because of reasons that I think withstand philosophical scrutiny. Right? I don't think that I have good philosophical reasons for being an atheist. And that's why I teeter between apatheist and atheist, right? Like I mostly don't care about the question of whether a God exists. But, you know, if you were to press me on it, I would admit that I am an atheist. So the ideas that Michael Shermer put forth, I agree with, for the reasons that my understanding of what he's saying are things that happen below the threshold of consciousness. He's not saying that we feel an emotion, we recognize that emotion, and then make decisions based on our feeling of that emotion about what we want, what our beliefs are, what our decisions are, and stuff like that. As I understand what he's saying, based on the research of other people like Antonio Damasio and Michael, I think his last name is pronounced Gazinga, the field of neuroscience kind of has this parsed out pretty well. The emotional reaction that they're talking about is a distinction that has to do with neurology. So we make decisions based on preferences, and preferences are considered an affective response. And then afterwards, our left hemisphere is really good at justifying reasons why we came to that conclusion. So that's just a bit of science that Michael Shermer is referencing. And it resonates with me because, like I said, I think that just organically, the way that my preferences have been built upon previous experience, those preferences determine the beliefs that I have in a way that I don't have a conscious control of. And if you were to ask me why I believe what I believe, the answer that I would give you would be a post hoc rationalization.
Very good. Thank you. All right, Ned, give us a shot at it here.
Well, I mean, I'll try to dumb it down a little bit. I can't remember exactly who said this. That's why I'm saying dumb it down, because my source material is not at hand. Is that I honestly believe the philosophical stance that we do things for one of two reasons. We're avoiding pain or we're trying to receive pleasure, period. And when we look at the driver, regardless how philanthropic we want to be or altruistic or anything, it still boils down to, at least in my opinion, one of the two drivers. So at that point, if I'm going to be honest with myself and I say, why do I believe? Is it because I'm worried about what the consequences of a God being there would be to me in a negative sense? Or is it I am trying to receive some pleasure that I couldn't get if God was there? That is one line of thinking. On the other end of it is I could completely flip that and say that, I come at it from the other end. I won't go in, to line for line. I think everybody can follow where I'm going there. But then doing the post hoc, like Chris was saying, I don't know if I follow that completely. I really value vetting my beliefs. At least I'd like to think I do. And I know that I've changed multiple times on really big issues when faced with some facts that I couldn't get around, namely homosexuality and my belief when I was an idiot 20-year-old versus what I was a day after, I was faced with a hardcore fact of, hey, how you should feel toward those individuals. And so I can see that if you, even as much as you want to believe something and want it to be true, and you can avoid quote unquote capital T truth, I think if you value vetting what is real more than your emotional driver, and I'm not saying we can do that with everything, but at least in certain areas, I think there's a way around the problem. Not saying I found it. I'm just saying I think that I try to, if nothing else, if that helps.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ned. All right, Trey. There's kind of two secular atheistic perspectives. Give us a Christian version.
Yeah, certainly. I'll be honest. Michael Shermer makes a lot of valid and interesting perspectives when it comes to the motivations behind why we do things, and the Christian worldview would fit well into that as well. Obviously, I grew up in a Christian family. That's not to say that I agreed with everything that I understand now. Quite the opposite. I didn't live a lifestyle necessarily that met into that, but I never really doubted God's existence growing up either. So, I met with different challenges as time went on, but the nature of the Christian faith is to actually be convicted and inspired and transformed and have a difference, the very nature of change of heart, which you might say. So the emotional response is essential to the act of becoming a Christian. There is a distinct nature in our experience where we are inspired to deny ourselves something that is intrinsically challenging and to adopt principles that we would not do otherwise. So, yeah, no, I would say that that he made very astute observations as a Christian, and I would also say that Ned has an excellent point afterwards. We adopt specific things because of emotional bias, like, for instance, shame, guilt, forms of shame and guilt lead to repentance, which is a huge aspect of our faith. But there is an aspect to where certain ideals and concepts that we have logically flow into other ideals and concepts. So there are ones that we will adopt that might not have would be tied to something we've accepted on an emotional basis, but is just a logical conclusion of something we've already accepted, something that integrates into our worldview, and that would be part of the justification or the rationalization process. I anticipate that with anybody who has that worldview, and like I said, I think Ned made it a astute observation in that regard. Our worldview, the things we adopt emotionally, has consequences that go beyond the initial adoption, and there are things that, ways that we will test our ideas, either empirically or experientially, that verify or can change our worldview. Even after my conversion, I was personally an evolutionist. I grew up in that mentality. I was educated in that mentality, and I had no reason to doubt it. But when I realized that there was a logical contradiction in that, thanks to somebody who was generous enough to point it out at my expense, make no mistake, I realized a logical contradiction there, and it helped shape a lot of the views I had later, understanding that I had made that mistake and that I had to regard my worldviews differently. But there was a significant emotional motivator there. The concept of having something that you're so convicted of and believing in be wrong, intrinsically wrong, logically wrong, and unbelievable. It really did. It transformed my perspective on many things, even after my conversion experience. But personally, I think one of my favorite people who describes it best would be the philosopher Blaise Pascal. He said, all men seek happiness. This is without exception. Whatever different means they employ, they all tend to this end, the cause of some going to war and others avoiding it. It's the same desire in both, attended with different views. This is the motive of every action of every man, even those who hang themselves. The interesting part is, what the significant motivator would be, the difference between a person who would take the idea of pain and suffering to the point of suicide versus a person who would take it to repentance. And that's where, the distinction of our faith is. We believe that the pain and the sorrow that leads to repentance is of godly blessing, and that the pain and suffering that would lead to suicide or continual suffering and abandonment is pain and suffering and death. So that would be my worldview.
All right, thanks. The only contribution I would make to that in looking from a Christian worldview perspective in dealing with sort of the way that Dr. Shermer put it, and Dr. Nicolai, as again a clinical psychiatrist and professor at Harvard, was illustrating. And first and foremost is that God has a personality. So we would expect within humankind at least an interaction with emotion, whether or not the specific premise of we make our initial decisions emotionally first and then find reasons to justify them on the back end. And he did put a careful caveat there saying most of us. I really don't think that there's any contemporary, Spocks running around that are just pure logic and pure reason. And I think the reason that this was interesting to me personally is typically from certain secularist and atheist crowds is the idea of things like reason rallies, as though they construct their worldviews based on reason, and the rest of us dumb religious people just use emotion and we're illogical and so on. That's the impression anyway. Whether or not that's what they intend to convey as they promote these types of events or not is something of a different story. It's conveyed as though those of us that are religious are emotional and stupid. So to hear that particular atheist and others, as I quoted, and I'm sure there's several others, to kind of admit that no, emotions play a vital role. I would say the Christian worldview explains that, and in two ways, very similar to what Trey had said, that there's kind of a suppression or an emotional resistance to the idea of God for a couple reasons. Number one, the quest for autonomy, that it's not really the data, if you will, or the information, positive or lack thereof, that causes one to reject the existence of God, that it is emotional. It's a particular lifestyle that one has accommodated toward. So at this point, I'm kind of agreeing with Paul Johnson at this point that one finds themselves enjoying a particular type of lifestyle, and to have an authoritarian figure of such magnitude and omniscient, omnipresent, a being that will hold one accountable and that sees all things, that's going to be resisted in a sense. And so there's going to be those emotional reasons to reject it. Also, the trauma of holiness. When one considers purity and holiness to the level that is expressed in both the Old and New Testament, as describing the triune God of Scripture, is something to genuinely be avoided. Thomas Aquinas had famously said that, it's not that everybody's running towards God. Everybody is running toward the blessings that God may offer, but everybody, for the most part, is running as hard and as fast as they can away from God. And there are, again, emotional reasons for that. And so what stimulates or generates one to understand their brokenness? The gospel essentially is for a broken person. You have to be, poor in spirit. And you get to that point feeling the weight of the law of God, a law that demands absolute perfection in all things. And when one is brought to the end of themselves, they're at an emotionally right place, contrite, broken in spirit, to be able to confess and receive what God has provided as a way to reconcile that person to himself through the mediated work of his Son, through Christ and him crucified for sinners and resurrected. That is the atoning thing that unites a broken, sinful person to God. And so, yes, there is an emotional exchange within that. And so, yeah, piggybacking on basically what Trey had said, there's not much more I could add to that other than the Christian worldview explains the emotional aspect on kind of both ends. And so from that, fellas, let's piggyback on to kind of the next question is, have any of you made a significant change in your worldview? And that could be from Christianity or some spiritual worldview to atheism or the other. I know, Trey, you've kind of hinted at this already as to being raised in a Christian home, but having a conversion experience and having some changes within that. And that goes for you, Chris, and you, Ned, as well. Have you pretty much always been a secularist or an atheist, but you've maybe shifted certain specifics within that worldview? And what role would you confess or admit or say that emotions had to do with that? Chris, you go ahead, bud.
Thank you. So the question that I'm responding to is, can I think of a significant change, a moment where I had a significant change in my worldview, and what role did emotion have in that, right? So I have to be honest, off the top of my head, I can't really think of anything super drastic, because the older you get, the more you view your past as just like a smooth, linear thing that it's really not. It's just based on memory. As I admitted in my description up front, my atheism has very little to do with like an epiphany or anything like that. It's just like, as my life developed, it manifested atheism as something that I believed in when it came to this specific question. So, the role of emotion in that. Obviously, I live the life that I prefer, right? I'd have to be a bit of a masochist to live a life that I didn't prefer. So, moving towards something that is good, as Ned puts it, or even moving towards something that has glory, as you've put it, Landon, the role of emotion is the same, right? So we can step back from whether it's a secular or a glorious version of moving towards something good. What we consider good is positive, and positive engenders preferences, and preferences are emotions. So, of course, I wouldn't live a lifestyle that I didn't like. And did my lifestyle influence my decisions and my beliefs? Of course. But I can't think of a precipitating event, a very specific event, where something happened and a light bulb went off and I was like, I'm going to change the way I think about X, Y, or Z.
Okay, awesome. Ned, how about yourself? I know we've had private conversations over the years and whatnot. I know that your background is a little bit different than that. So, what kind of explain your, if you want to use the term, deconversion or shift from one worldview to another?
Yeah, sure. And I'd like to point out, Mowdy, he's getting old, but I think I've got him for a few years, and I'll give at least two examples since he can't even come up with one. I grew up in the South, and even though my parents were very secular, we were definitely, I guess, kind of the outlier there. My dad, he's an engineer, and that kind of drives his, the way that he thinks. And I think that with the way we were brought up, they pretty much let us go whichever way we want to. Exactly what I'm doing with my kids. I'm very hands off, and hopefully they know very little about what I believe, at least until they get to be like my daughter's age, when they're mid to kind of late teens now. But I want them to find what's real based on almost scientific methodology. I want them to observe and figure things out through that way. And granted, it's somewhat dangerous. Like Shannon pointed out earlier, my daughter is now deist, so I've lost her, but whatever. And again, I honestly don't care. I'm happy for her. It makes her happy. That's great. But as far as personally, I had a couple of scholarships, and one of them ended up being at Oral Roberts University. I was naive enough at the time to think that they honestly, when they asked who was saved and who wasn't, they wanted to know the truth. And so I didn't raise my hand. I didn't, I let them know I'm not yet. And there's reasons that drove them to, for lack of a better term, harass. I got to do extra Bible study just about 3 times a week, every week in the prayer tower, which didn't go well for either side. And it wasn't hostile. It wasn't negative, so to speak. But again, I'm young. I'm late teens, early 20s. And I think we all at that point think we've got things figured out. And I want to go up there and say, okay, this is why I don't believe. Show me why I'm wrong, which was the worst approach I could make. But interestingly, during that time, my best friend had come to me, and we had these kind of conversations off and on. I mean, I've known him since I was about 5 years old, and he brought me what I now know to be the watchmaker paradox, fallacy, however you want to say it. And to be honest, that really did hit home at that point, and it did lead me, at least for a time, in the direction of, this actually could make sense. If I've got a very complex mechanism, I am going to be rational enough to look at that and go, that didn't just happen. That had to be put together. Now, since then, I've, of course, become aware of the problems with that argument, but that was a foundational change. I definitely at that point started to, at least in part, believe that it was possible for there to be a God existing. Whereas before that, I would have called myself a hardcore, almost Hitchens type, like atheist. You can imagine how that went over at ORU. And then the other one that was foundational, I mean, this one literally rocked my world. I mentioned earlier, I was sitting home with my dad, and we were watching something on TV, and, coming from Texas, all of my redneck friends, and, I mean, again, I love my redneck friends, don't get me wrong. And Landon, I know you're down there right now. So, but there tends to be this negative connotation with some people down there when it comes to homosexuality. And there was a news story on or something, and my dad's sitting there reading the paper, and I popped off, as an ignorant 20-year-old will do, and say, excuse my language here, but if any faggot came up to me and said like that, I would whip his ass 10 ways from, and went on rambling for, a couple of minutes, as I do here. And my dad just dropped his paper, looked over the top of his paper, and said, if you ever say anything that ignorant again, I'll kick you out of this house faster than you can get packed. And it just floored me. And I mean, he could see on my face, I'm shocked. And he goes, look, think of it this way. If a woman came up to you and came on to you in that way, you would be flattered, even if she wasn't attractive. You wouldn't be aggressive. You definitely wouldn't strike her. There would be no negative feelings, no animosity whatsoever. But when you have someone who's of the same sex, especially in the society that we live in, have the bravery to come up and find you attractive enough to go out on a limb and potentially put themselves at harm like you're talking about doing, how can you look at that as a negative? How can you look at that as something that should be berated and even met with hostility? That's ignorant. You should be more flattered than if a woman came up to you and did that. And that was foundational. I mean, it absolutely changed the way that I thought, not only about homosexuality and all of that, but literally how I approach just about everything that I hold as a truth now. Because I was certain that homosexuality was wrong and it was gross and it was all this stuff. It completely changed it. And if I could be that wrong at that fundamental of a level, I've got to be open enough to say anything I could be wrong about. I can't be dogmatic about any of my beliefs at this point. And to be honest, the enjoyment that I got out of, for lack of a better term, coming to that revelation, man, it was life changing. So those are my two, I guess, examples, at least the ones that came to the top of my head. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ned. And it does help to get the background and how you guys, were all raised. On the one hand, what parts of your worldview that you embraced within your family that you felt compelling, satisfying, so on and so forth, what you kind of resisted. And a lot of those personal stories are very helpful. Now, I know, Trey, you've sort of hinted at already sort of your growth and development, again, being raised in a Christian home. And, I know you personally very well, so I know you're several generations of Christian lineage, certainly at least through your mom. What significant changes did you make? And let's, again, this isn't necessarily grand sweeping worldview, although that's really vital. But even within the niche market of particulars of, say, secularism, atheism, or within your version of Christianity, Trey, you describe yourself as Reformed and Southern Baptist. Has that always been your distinct worldview as far as that goes?
Well, actually, it's interesting. My family's all predominantly military. My father has a doctorate in counterterrorism, and works for the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. It's a particular mindset, and we have a very, like you said, ingrained military culture, and part of that isn't just moving around from place to place. Part of it is attending chapel services, which are more interfaith, what you might say. So, a lot of when I was young, what you would call a variety of churches, or experience a variety of different liturgies and stuff of that nature. So, as I got older, we found a church that was more to our preference as a family. But yeah, I always grew up with the concept that God was real. On a personal level, it's not so much relevant to you when you're young, except as is always the joke when you need to take a test, or when you desire something. As with most things, you pray, when you're hurt or when you're in trouble. But it's not so much the nature of the Christian faith as you learn later, both through the word, reading the scriptures and gaining an understanding, and then most significantly, the conviction that is placed upon you. The interesting part about the Christian faith is, even growing up in it, the nature, the doubt exists for all of us. But what you experience, Mike might say fire and brimstone, which I had no doubt, been dismissive of many times before. But, the conviction of my personal sin and the consequences on the cross and the sacrifice of Jesus Christ and things of that nature. During my conversion experience, it created a remarkable change in my life, in the character of how I chose to live. I no longer wanted to just live as I had chosen. I had a distinct desire to repent of what I had done, something that is a hard concept for somebody who's much younger, obviously, to make, because I'll be honest, if I stole a cookie from the cookie jar, I wasn't really feeling bad about it unless I got caught. But with time, wisdom, I gained this understanding. But even inside of that, I had to have transformative experiences. I've changed my mind several times on many things. Ironically, even with the acceptance of the gospel and the understanding of the gospel, experientially, I knew I was a sinner. To be honest, it's one of the largest evidences of the faith is a personal level, is I know that's true. It's not something where, it can be easily taken from me. But that doesn't mean that, I had everything figured out at a young age. Obviously, there's significant more that would logically flow from that. Gaining understanding of doctrine and the history of my faith and the nature of the scriptures themselves. It does give you a specific logical mindset that flowed from something as simple as accepting the gospel in the first place. But just as that was a character challenge moment, a transformation of how I had to live my life and how I was going to live my life for the rest of my life. Just as that was that challenge for me there, I had an intellectual challenge as well, that happened to me in high school. I was scientifically inclined. You know, I taught biology, like freshman biology, while I was a junior in high school. It was a program where, you were allowed to be a student teacher. And I took college classes while I did it. It was one of those things where I was very devoted, dedicated to the sciences, and there was a distinct point where somebody came and was teaching, and was teaching against evolution, and so I went there to correct his misunderstandings. But he was able to do something very simply that pointed out the errors that was going on. Not so much just to say that with evolution, but with how I was being taught, because like Michael Shermer said, there is a attribution bias. There's a confirmation bias that goes on. I was being educated in school, but all education is a form of indoctrination. So the confirmation bias I was experiencing and the attribution bias I experienced, I was not being given a broad perspective. I was being taught empirical methodology, and yet when I would be exposed to the perspectives that were being pushed in the class, I learned experimentation, but at the same time I was learning an origin methodology. So the problem I ran into was it occurred to me very specifically that there was a separation there. I had adopted both perspectives, assuming both were correct, and and all it took was somebody to point out what you would call my biases, a lack of looking at the alternative evidences, and being dismissive of those evidences instantaneously. And it occurred to me the logical mistake there. So as much as my conversion experience was what changed my character, a lot of what I think and how I would be more meticulous and careful in informing my worldview, my opinions, and my beliefs became more methodological after realizing some of the biases I had been exposed to involuntarily, and had just automatically adopted. There's a significant emotional aspect to that as well, because especially when you're something where you're very convicted about something to the point where you would teach others, and you realize that, like I said, Ned had his own individual bias. Likewise, anytime you have a particular bias and you overcome it, and you realize that you've subjected others to it, there's a guilt to go to weigh in with that. So I felt very heavily the consequences of what I had been teaching, even in the school, and it radically transformed how I viewed everything more, what you would call empirically. I wanted to look at the evidences of faith. In fact, even so much so, I went to a secular program that taught all 6 of the top world religions. So I'm familiar with all 6 of the top world religions, not just Christianity. And to that degree, there was, you see the radical change that comes afterwards, and you experience the emotion. You don't necessarily dwell on it, but, in retrospect, it is highly motivational, the distinct amount of guilt that you can be, that you can process when you experience your own personal, mistakes and the like. and then in retrospect, yeah, the change is more emotionally it's more emotionally appreciated, because it, in many ways, it is it protects you, and it unifies your mindset from the previous mistake that you made. So just as repentance, repentance, saved me from my sin and my guilt, and allows me to experience a relationship with Jesus Christ, forming my worldview intellectually, and leaving some of my personal biases behind, allowed me to gain an understanding both inside of my faith and of how I adopt other worldviews, or other aspects, and how I deal intellectually with other things as well. So, yeah, there's a heavy drive emotionally for those things.
Well, awesome. Yeah, and that, again, thanks for specifying within the Christian framework itself. I think for my own story is I started out adolescence, was raised in, definitely not a pro-Christian home by any stretch, wasn't condemning of it. Had I chose to go that route, I went to public school, paid attention. By the time I was in junior high, I was emotionally satisfied as an atheist. To kind of agree with Mike Shermer, I primarily liked the music better. I liked heavy metal a lot more than I liked Loretta Lynn, and just felt like that fit my mood a lot more significantly. Degraded to an agnostic by the end of my senior year. Some of the things that began to loosen up my tight grip on atheism was the inadequacy of evolution. Number one, I wanted to see living missing links and transitions. I didn't want to hear stories about things that's in the dirt that could have any number of explanations. I wanted to see something. I wanted to see a living Neanderthal walking around right now that I could point to and say, yeah, there's the transition. I wanted to see, creatures moving around that has scales and feathers both on it. I wanted to see a lot of those to kind of show this grand meta narrative of descent with modification from a common ancestor. And those things lacking began to kind of crack the solid foundation I had. And to be quite honest, when I went to my first funeral at 16, my great grandmother's funeral, was the first time I ever really saw death. And that kind of put a spotlight on the inadequacy of my own personal life, that it was a lot of despair, a lot of failure, misery, disappointment, and in a purely atheistic worldview that didn't leave a whole lot. There was nothing really left but the thought of death, to just go to sleep and never wake up again, kind of take the pain away sort of thing. And, it wasn't till a little bit later that I found that that's a common theme within atheistic thought, which is what kind of degraded me to agnosticism, to kind of back up and think of something deeper spiritually. Albert Camus said in An Absurd Reasoning, "There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, comes afterwards. These are games. One must first answer the question of suicide." Heinrich Heine, "Sleep is good, death is better. But of course, the best would be never to have been born at all." That's from his book Morphine, or his poem Morphine. Gustav Flaubert, in his famous quote, "To be stupid, selfish, and have good health are 3 requirements for happiness. Though if stupidity is lacking, all is lost." Famous Voltaire quote in his book Candid, "100 times I wished to kill myself, but my love of life persisted. This ridiculous weakness is perhaps one of the most fatal of our faults. For what could be more stupid than to go on carrying a burden that we always long to lay down, to loathe and yet cling to existence, in short, to cherish the serpent that devours us until it has eaten our hearts." And of course, Nietzsche's famous quotes, "The thought of suicide is a great consolation. By means of it, one gets through many a dark night. The only means of supporting the burden of existence slave morality is essentially the morality of utility. And that's in Robert Beck's Perspectives on Philosophy, page 370. There's several of these quotes. The idea that in the wake of Darwin's publication, this comes from Daniel Dennett's Darwin's Dangerous Idea. Even he admits. Friedrich Nietzsche, quote, this idea of eternal recurrence became a cornerstone of his nihilism. The idea of the origin of the species, that's on page 181. And Dr. Alman Nikolai, in his book, quoting Sigmund Freud in Civilization and Its Discontents, it has been well recorded that Freud utilized cocaine in order to relieve his depression, as he noted in some of his personal letters. His depression was so bad at some points, he flirted with the idea of suicide, as he had expressed in his poems and other letters. Freud seemed to have an almost obsession and preoccupation with death and pessimism. In a letter to Carl Abraham, he wrote, there's a sort of senile depression which centers in a conflict between an irrational love of life and a more sensible resignation. And finally, Freud writes in Civilization is Discontent, what good to us is a long life if it is difficult and barren of joys, and if it is full of misery that we can only welcome death as its deliverer. Freud appeared to be aware of the relationship between his worldview and his pessimism. Freud appeared to know his worldview offered little hope for happiness, but he felt powerless to do anything about it. And of course, Schopenhauer's famous quote, you may look upon life as an unprofitable episode, disturbing the blessed calm of non-existence. Ask the dead whether they'd like to resurrect, and they'll negatively shake their heads. And this was exactly my sentiment as a teenager. I didn't have access to that litany of intellectual titans within secular faith, but I resonated with it and degraded to an agnostic. So from an atheist making fun of Christians, picking on them, to kind of a hardline agnostic, similar to what Shermer's position is, that I don't know and you don't know either. And moving from that to the Christian worldview was the uniqueness within the Christian scriptures themselves and the primary figure, which was Jesus of Nazareth. Completely unique in its proclamation and its description. And of course, the person of Christ being unique, claiming to be God Almighty in human flesh and proving it by resurrecting from the dead, all set that as something unique. Now, where was my emotion in that role? I mean, I would be dishonest if I didn't, share to a certain extent, number one, seeing the death of my great-grandmother, realizing that life, why would we evolve the ability to desire meaning if none existed? Why would we evolve such a frustrating, pointless, why would we just make ourselves Sisyphus and just push boulders every day? So there was a sense to where I longed for meaning because my life was frustrating. And second was I had a dream one night where a tornado was coming through my work where I used to work. And in this dream, the tornado was sucking me up. And as I was about to die, I found myself praying a sinner's prayer, so to speak, something like that. And I remembered waking up at the time, being an agnostic, thinking, I can't live that kind of lie. It's just inconsistent to think I can cling to an agnosticism and not pursue this much deeper and think that if God exists, that he would accept that. That if God exists, he wouldn't let me die in a way that I could just cash in at the end, since that was my plan. And so I dug in a little heavier. I started pursuing it deeper. And that's where I found the Judeo-Christian faith, again, exclusively unique amongst all other world religions. And I found it emotionally satisfying. So with that said, fellows, moving to kind of the next questioning, with this realization of emotions and worldview, what does this say about objective truth, the facts of reality? If emotions are such guidelines, why do we all disagree so much on our worldview? Christopher, take a shot at it, bud.
So this is right up my alley. The reason why we have such different worldviews is because of individual differences. That's what the field of psychology studies. I manage a laboratory that studies psychology, experimental psychology. So individual differences are exactly what we study. the reason why people are different is because people are different, right? It has everything to do with genes and genotypes and phenotypes and gamete donors, and you can get into weird explanations as far as what accounts for the fact that we're not making carbon copies of each other. That being said, let's see. The fact that we make decisions based on emotion and then post hoc give rationalizations, what does that say about our worldview? I think what it says, I mean, from a secular perspective, it's just what the data bores out, right? Or bears out, I should say. Like, what are we going to, when you have a question and you're trying to answer it, there are many different methods with which you could try to answer it, right? Some of them are deemed more valid in certain circles than others. In the circles of science and or philosophy are verbal arguments that are able to sustain a certain proposition and justify it so that it's a warranted belief. And science is natural philosophy. That's its origin. But science has developed to be something a little bit different. It's natural answers to natural questions. So in science, in neurology, in the neurosciences, it's shown that when it comes to simple decisions, people make their decisions based on preferences, and then if you were to ask them afterwards, they will let you know an explanation that may or may not have anything to do with the actual reason why they made the decision that they did. This is borne out in hemisphere studies, in neurological studies. Michael Gazzaniga has 30 years under his thumb of research where he severs the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is what connects your left and right hemisphere of your brain. And for people with really bad seizure disorders, like grand mal seizures, it needs to be severed so that the electrical stimulation from one side doesn't travel to the other side, because that's what causes these horrific seizures. If you cut the corpus callosum, which is absolutely a drastic measure, the left and right side of your brain can't communicate with each other. It turns out when you study people who have had this procedure and you present information to their left or right brain via optical, right, presentations, they can't do things, right? They can't do things that we normally can based on regular information. They can't tell you that the word shirt was displayed on the left-hand side, but they can draw it. And then if you ask them amongst 4 pictures which one it is, they might pick one that has nothing to do with the actual word and come up with a crazy justification of why they chose that picture. Crazy to our standards because it just seems so convoluted. So within neuroscience, the left side of the left hemisphere of the brain is pretty much made to give explanations why A happened and B happened. Are they correlated? Are they temporal? What caused it? What's the explanation? What's the reason? What is going on in my environment? Evolutionarily speaking, that's going to contribute to my survival. That's how it works. So, from a secular position where we believe in evolution, or we trust the theory of evolution, however you want to phrase it, it makes sense that we mostly have intuitive cognitions, which is like the fast thinking. And then when it comes to more complex problems, we engage in slow thinking. And that's where like philosophy and reason and rational arguments and stuff like that come into play. But on a day-to-day basis, it makes perfect sense within a secular worldview that most of our decisions are based on preferences. And if pressed to answer why we made those decisions, we would make stuff up, pardon my language. We would make stuff up.
Well, let me ask you this, Chris, then what does that say about the objectivity of truth? Like, why would we trust your emotions, or why would we trust my emotions when we have competing worldviews? Which How does that fit into that?
I personally, I don't think that humans are capable of objectivity. I think that there are threads of continuity between perception, which allows us to interact with each other in our perceived yet different with commonalities, right? Venn diagram, your reality, my reality. There's some continuity there that allows us to have interactions where we understand each other's language and we answer each other's questions, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think that it's not a goal of mine to achieve some form of objectivity.
Okay, right? I understand.
So it's tough for me to answer that.
Sure. No, that's good. That's good. Ned, you're up, bud.
Okay. Yeah, I probably mirror a lot of what Chris said there, but I guess try to take a little bit of different tact on it in that, yeah, I do think that it boils down to comfort. I think that when we find something that, for lack of a better term, makes the world make sense, we like that. And if I'm satisfied with that understanding, like Chris was saying, post hoc, I'm going to find every reason to hang on to that and cling on to that good feeling. And for good, bad, or indifferent, I enjoy the mystery. The quotes that, you were giving, they, for lack of a better term, they confuse me. The way that I look at life, it's nowhere close to as dreary and horrific as all of those people make it sound. To me, it's, I don't want to say every day, but for the most part, it's an adventure. I mean, I love my existence. I love my kids. I love my wife. I've got a great job. Life's fun. And that, and the only reason I can do what I do is because of the approach that I've taken to learning. And I guess that when you have a goal, and again, I am a very goal-driven type guy. In other words, I believe that the reason we act is based on goals that we have, either conscious or subconscious. And again, those goals are driven by pleasure versus pain. So I enjoy what has resulted from the way that my mind thinks now. So why I'm different than someone who is more emotionally driven, I believe because the way that they live, that emotional based reasoning brings them pleasure, or at least, I don't think it avoids pain. I think that it does bring them pleasure. I think that believing that God is watching, that believing that they're going to have afterlife is a very nice thought. And to be honest, it would be a nice thought for me too. I've admitted this 1,000 times that going to the grave is, let's be clear, I'm not afraid of it, and it doesn't weigh on me, but it is disappointing. Someone, and it may have been, actually, now that I think it may have been Mowdy that said this at one point, is that the way that a good way to view it is that you have to leave a party early. There's a great party going on, and there's a bunch of stuff playing later on, and fireworks and cookout and all this stuff, but for whatever reason, you've got to leave early. That is death to me. I'm gonna miss out on the end of the party. That's the only thing that bothers me about death. In the interim, though, I'm gonna have fun at the party. I'm going to do what I can, and the best way that I've seen to facilitate that is to think the way that I think. And I like to think it's based in reason, it's based in logic. But at the same time, I admit, just like everybody else, there is a component, a very large component, that is emotional there. Because, like it or not, the things that bring me solace, the things that bring me happiness, if I find that they are not true, if they're not real, that's going to be painful. And it's very difficult to teach somebody something in an environment that is painful or uncomfortable. Being an educator, that's one of my goals, especially since most of the training I do is one-on-one, is to try to make the experience as pleasurable as possible because I know my students learn best if they're having a good time. Vice versa, the drill sergeant type approach. Yes, there's a component there to break people down and to make them, I guess, more pliable. But if you want people to learn, you have to give them a goal to want to learn it, and then, as importantly, make it enjoyable during the learning experience. So I think that the reason that we're different, the reason that you've got people that are so almost compartmentalized in completely conflicting philosophies and epistemologies, is because my thought process may be painful for them, and their thought process may be painful for me. And we gravitate, like Mouty was saying, because we are different from a physiological standpoint, all the way up through, our emotional and mental aspects. We're going to have different pleasures. In the same way that you may like vanilla ice cream, I like chocolate. When we go to pick the deal, you can say, well, vanilla's the best. What are you thinking? Why are you picking chocolate? Because I get more pleasure from chocolate than I do vanilla. I get more pleasure from thinking this way than thinking that. And I think that is the fundamental underpinning to why there is so much diversity throughout all of the philosophies.
Okay, that's fair. Would you add anything more than what Christopher did in terms of what delineates which worldview is true? Do you think that emotions prevent that from establishing, or what does that say about, let's say, reason or the universal laws of logic or something like that?
Well, I do think that there is a capital T truth to a lot of things, if not most things. Like I said, I'm a naturalist. That kind of lends itself to having an explanation on most, if not all, well, definitely all things. So I do think that there is an objective reality out there. Now, what's funny is that objective reality, maybe we may be in a computer simulation. You've heard probably people talk about me in particular, kind of using that as an analogy from time to time. So whatever the reality is, I think there is a reality. I think the ability to ferret out what that reality is in large part predicated on one's ability to divorce themselves from the emotion and say, look, I don't care what the reality is. If there's a God, so be it. If there's not a God, so be it. If we're a computer construct, so be it. I just want to know. And therefore, I am going to force myself into a position to where, through whatever methodology, it's going to reveal this about the nature of reality. And I'm faced with that fact, good, bad, or indifferent. I don't have a choice, maybe not to accept it, but to at least acknowledge that that's what this data set is telling me at this time.
Okay.
If we can divorce ourselves from the drivers behind why we want to believe things, we can get to that. Problem is I don't think a lot of us are capable, myself included.
Okay. And real quick before I move to Trey, is there that you guys are aware of answers to this particular question in terms of emotion and how that affects objective worldviews within the atheistic community that you disagree with, that you think, well, when atheists say X, Y, and Z, that's not my version of atheism? Is there anything out there that you guys know of that you would want to make, kind of known for the betterment of discussion, or in a couple minutes?
Well, I think most people know. In fact, I get berated quite a bit from the community that I'm not the Hitchens type atheist. I don't agree with that methodology. Again, if you think of the way that Hitchens approached most Christians, it was belittling, it was berating, and it, in my opinion, didn't serve to enlighten anyone, or well, maybe not anyone, but at least a lot of people. Because again, he's training or teaching through an uncomfortable and just such a grating approach. And I think that if we can go into it more like what we do, and again, I get pleasure for them, so it's hard for me to say that this is the right way to do it without acknowledging that, hey, I get pleasure for it. So, I'm sure Hitchens enjoyed what he did. And I know there's a lot of people out there that enjoy that method and like seeing people ridiculed and whatever. But the point that I'm making is I don't agree with and I'm going to get beat up for this too, but the dogmatic approach to atheism. If you're not open enough to say that, look, I could be wrong and there could be a God, I tend to put you almost in the same camp as the ultra fundamentalist Christian, in that there has to be a God, and I don't want to hear any of your explanations or any of your quote unquote evidences away from it. La, 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 I can't hear you, because both of them are doing exactly the same thing. I have this vested belief. It is mine, and I don't care what you tell me. You're not moving me. Okay. I don't tolerate that on either end. I just don't. So I would say that probably cuts at least 10 to 50% of the atheist community out of my camp.
Okay. Christopher, do you want to add anything to that real quick?
Oh, I'd like to add so much to that. Not the least of which is earlier in this hangout, I think Ned was talking about homosexuality, and I hope it's not too risque to say that, you know, I'm not a homosexual, but I think that I would hang out and make out with Ned's voice at least for a good long weekend.
Wow.
Just because I'm attracted to his mind. That's all. I'm just attracted to his mind. I don't know what he looks like. I have no idea what he looks like.
Well,
attracted to his mind and his voice.
and there's a reason that I hide behind this icon, because you know, I do have that
because you're so pretty.
Yeah, I've got the look that just absolutely is made for radio and this type of thing. So, but thank you, Christopher. See, and the difference is even though I'm not gay either, you from a visual standpoint even get me that point. So,
hey, I'm not fishing. I am not fishing for compliments.
Well,
I'm not baiting you to tell me about my eyes.
Well, see, and I'm not worried so much about it, because I know that that, you know, you're recently engaged and that type of thing. So I feel fairly safe in, you know, going this way. So I'm not too bad here.
So that being said,
yes.
And the reason why I totally want to make out with Ned is because his ideas resonate with me so well. Yeah, the dogmatic atheism. He and I have both gotten in trouble over the past 3 to 5 years, if not longer, about us not being strident, militant atheists. So that brings me to the real answer to the question that you asked, Landon, which is the thing that I'm least concerned with are labels. You can call me whatever you want. Like, I self-label as an apatheist. I self-label as an atheist. That's fine and well.
Do you admit, though, that labels are necessary, right?
They're necessary for certain things, right?
Okay.
Labels are necessary to, you know, categorizing is natural. I'll put it there.
There you go. Okay.
Categorizing is natural. And depending on the level of conversation you want to have, right? If you want to have a serious, deep, one-to-one conversation with somebody, you should be able to shed the layers of social construct of labels and just be able to talk to somebody about what they actually believe, regardless of the label they use for themselves and what that label means to you, regardless of that person, right? You should want to talk to that person. And I think that's where, you know, once again, having Ned and I on this hangout as the prototypical atheists was the wrongest idea, because he and I are so moderate. We get into so much trouble for not being new atheist, militant. Like everything he was saying about Hitchens, I was just like, exactly. Hitchens and Dawkins, they're shrill, appeals to emotion. There's a biologist that shouldn't dip into philosophy. There's somebody who's really smart and snarky, just gaining points in rhetoric, which has nothing to do with anything. Like, it's not convincing in any way, shape, or form, unless you're so shallow that, you know, like, poning somebody means that you're right. You know, like, nothing about the new atheist movement charms me anymore. I'm not going to deny that it didn't ever. So Ned and I are on the same page about that. Making fun of Christopher Hitchens is awesome. Making fun of Richard Dawkins, I think he's the most shrill of the Four Horsemen, whatever that is. I think that Sam Harris has the most to contribute, and Daniel Dennett is the softest of the militant of the new atheists.
And according to Michael Roos, it seems as though Daniel Dennett has actually tried to back himself out of that camp, whether he's been successful at it or not.
He's also shown his butt. You know what I mean? Like he's the one who came up with the term brights.
Sure, right.
So let's face the fact.
Fair enough.
He might want to bow out, but based on the history that I understand, there's good reason for him to want to bow out.
No, yeah, and I think, and again, I'm just quoting from Michael Roos's 2015 book, Atheism, where he, as he was describing the new atheist, he put that caveat himself. So I'm quoting Michael Roos on that. That's not.
I gotcha. I'm with you.
Yeah.
And it's a good point.
Okay. I'm sorry. Did you have anything else, bud?
That's it. I was just going to say, and that's my answer.
Okay. Awesome. All right, Trey. I'm going to give you the floor for a little bit. You've seen the line of questioning. To just sort of restate for the listening audience, what does emotion play in terms of the objectivity of truth? And, on the back end of that, go ahead and address, are there Christians that you disagree with in terms of how they utilize emotion or, in terms of expressing the Christian worldview?
Yeah, most definitely. I'll start off with an old Dostoevsky quote. He said, "Man has such a predilection for systems and abstract deductions that he is ready to distort the truth intentionally. He is ready to deny evidence of his senses only to justify his logic." Dostoevsky had a really good point. More often than not, you're going to deny something that you could even observe, literally, even something that maybe you have empirically tested, because it's against the logic of how you've decided to rationalize or the worldview you have. So there's a principal question that often comes up, obviously, when you're discussing it is the objectivity angle. And there's dozens of analogies, but the most prevalent thing is empirically is, it's not the amount of faith you have, but it's the thing that you have faith in that will either sustain you or save you. So there's a couple of principles that people will empirically adopt in one aspect or another in some regard. So is there an overarching framework that we can adopt? Universal laws of logic. Obviously, like Ned, I'm a philosopher. I love that mentality. I love the mathematical precision to propositions and how you can flow from premises into logical conclusions or fallacies. So, that does it emotionally appeals to my mindset, philosophy in general. And so the aspect of these things, being able to communicate those with others, like I said, I think it's a privilege to be able to talk with atheists openly and honestly about things like that, because, in all reality, we do have a lot in common. We're all men. We all have, pain and suffering. We all have joys and happiness. So there's a regard to where, the communication experience is especially when it's open like this, it's enjoyable to actually get to represent some discourse and represent some variety of perspectives from different experiences and backgrounds. I think that diversity actually adds a lot to a conversation like this. But obviously, as a Christian, we apply to
Hey, Trey.
Yeah.
There you go, buddy. You had just covered your mic up somehow, and now you have opened it, so you're good.
Oh, okay. But as Christians, naturally, we look both to the transcendental, the objective, and to the empirical. So a lot of where we're gonna we look as far as our worldview goes, even emotionally, is towards the external. what is it that our faith that saves us? And even inside of our own faith, we have our own justification issues. There's people who have differences of opinion about history. We have these people who are revisionists, and they think that a progressive understanding is innately better than 2,000 years of scholarship comparatively, just for the sake of being a progressive scholar. That having a different this premise automatically makes us have completely different conclusions, and it's based on their personal preference for this progressive revisionist mindset, which, like I said, we're going to have completely different worldviews, and we're both from Christian backgrounds, mentalities, so there's going to provide a large amount of diversity there. There's we have people who are charismatics. They see the expression of their faith, and they want to experience it entirely emotionally and devoid of the history of the faith, or textual criticism, or any of or rational logic. Any of this stuff is irrelevant, because the emotional experience is the only thing to their faith. So there is a lot of diversity to where you can see, even inside of our own inside of the Christian faith, where people can completely neglect the truths and tenets of the faith in regards in favor of experiencing emotion, or where even a single preferential concept could lead to denying tenets of the faith as well. So this is something that we experience a lot, especially when you talk about apologetics, and you talk about discipleship, and you talk about evangelism and things like that, sharing your faith. You realize a lot of these things, there is an emotional bias to it. And like myself, somebody was kind enough to correct me when I was wrong, and I have experienced the benefits of that. I like the idea of correction, and I like the idea that somebody would care about me enough to rebuke me. Not the Christopher Hitchens style. Like I said, I get it. I personally always found him to be I like the English accent. He seemed entertaining to me. But the interesting part was, I like the idea of being rebuked for the sake of my own righteousness and correctness. And so this the mindset that there is an objective truth is incredibly relevant to our faith. We can't adopt just somebody else's emotional aspects, or even validate every person's experience. We actually reframe them inside of our worldviews, and it's instinctive to every person's worldview. We have charismatics. They think that they've had some transcendental, miraculous experience. If the empirical evidence is there, more often than not, even Christians will probably take the time, and we will work it in our worldview as something more rational. So the interesting aspects of how emotions can express and change the expression of our faith is pretty interesting in the variety that it puts out. But I would say that the most important thing is, especially with the purpose of justification, everybody wants to be able to justify their perspective or their worldview intrinsically. And so there's an aspect to where we have an understanding that there is a level of objective truth out there. And that's where, like I said, abstractions, logic, rational propositions, these things allow us to gain a better, more clear communication in these aspects. Or, like Christopher was saying, a warrant, a necessity, a sufficiency, the philosophical principle terms for how we justify our worldviews, not just to ourselves, but for others. And I can, like I said, between the emotional benefits of being corrected and being correct afterwards, and then and likely being able to provide that experience to others, and share the benefits you've had. I think that is an intrinsic aspect to the Christian worldview.
Awesome. Well, thank you, buddy. Due to the nature of the time, I'm just going to go ahead and skip kind of my last point I was going to make, and I wanted to give each of you sort of, I guess, just one last chance at to talk about this topic in general. But I did want you to do something specific. If each of you would want to ask a question of the other worldview, you could either ask Trey or myself, Chris or Ned. If there's basically one question sort of related to this topic in general you wanted to ask that we didn't answer, we'd love to have the opportunity to answer it. And yeah, if there was just anything left over that you guys wanted to clear up. Chris, go ahead.
You're killing me. I have a question for all of you, but I mean, I don't want to take up all the time. So I would like to, since Trey just talked, I'd like to ask him a question, or at least bring to bear how the reason why the idea that we make decisions based on emotions and then afterwards rationalize them, the reason why that's so interesting to me, and I think it's interesting to everybody on the panel, the way that they've been talking about it, is because that's exactly not how we want to think of ourselves, right? And the things that Trey was saying just a moment ago just brought it to bear for me, where it's just like atheists, right? I'm going to paint in broad strokes, right? My tribe, right? I self-label as an atheist. So, okay, so my tribe of atheists, they're always trying to let everybody know how rational and reasonable they are. And, you know, like all like this, that, and the other. And like, of course not. This is not an emotional response. I'm just passionate about being reasonable and logical. And it's just like, from my perspective, it's like, you are kidding yourself. You are kidding yourself about what you're saying right now. And from what Trey was just saying, I hope I'm not mischaracterizing you, and if I am, please let me know. Trey, it seemed like you were saying there is a preference to move away from explanations that are emotional and are more reasonable within the circles that you communicate or correspond with other Christians with, right? And to me, there seems to be a parallel. Both a certain kind of atheist and a certain kind of Christian want reasonableness and rationality to rule the day. And I think that, from my perspective, that's a mistake, right? And we can get into a whole discussion about that. I'm not saying that people shouldn't be reasonable or rational. I'm just saying when it comes to huge, complex questions like the great debate questions, that like going with intuition and going with trying to be completely irrational, logical, and philosophical, I think that's a mistake. That's my own personal perspective. That being said, go ahead.
There's an intrinsic aspect to our worldview that necessitates specifics, and like I said, it's not so much to appeal to the rational as much as the transcendental, the communications aspects, whether it be the experiential, like the nature of the gospel, which is personal sin and then repentance and how that works out in your life, or whether it's the rational explanations, whether it be a propositional argument. The nature of being a Christian is evangelical. So ironically, because of the call to evangelism, there is a demand for it. And I don't want to give the idea that it's completely propositional. I believe in what's called, I don't believe in what's called antricious conversion. Nobody thinks their way into a Christian worldview. The only people who can experience a Christian worldview are the people who experience the conviction of a Christian worldview. So that's what's it's called a contritious conversion. So the aspect I was trying to accentuate wasn't that you use rational arguments to be better communicative, but the principle is that we have a call to evangelism. So it kind of creates a requirement for specific ways of communicating, and specifically appeals to objective truths and specific objective realities, or transcendental if you prefer.
Well, I appreciate that clarification, and I think that you did a great job distinguishing what you meant versus what I understood. And it, oh man, there was a greater point that I wanted to make, and I wanted to bring Ned into it as well, but I can't think of it right now. I think it mostly has to do with the value that. Here's the question that I had for you specifically, Trey. Do you think that being evangelical and pursuing some apologetic approach kind of corners you into valuing reasonableness as compared to an emotional cause for your beliefs? I hope that question made sense.
Yeah, there's an aspect to where the better communicated a perspective is. Ironically, the evangelical aspect is highly personal, so it's basically has less to do with how I want to communicate it. More often, it has to deal with what the person want, or how the person wants to be communicated. Like talking with people like you and Ned, talking about empirical methodologies or philosophical principles is more simple. But if I'm talking to a friend of mine who just happens to be with me at the local Burger King, the conversation is going to take on a completely different aspect and tone. It's more personal than what you'd call just a methodological.
And let me add to that real quick, Christopher. I think the weight of your question for us as Christians is we are in an attempt to explain and defend what we consider objective truth. So it really is difficult to get out of that. There are some skilled apologists. We just feel that you almost have to have a PhD in philosophy to defend that what they call veridical self-authenticating faith. That in order to justify your own personal experience, in order to not, let's just say, what's typical in Mormon evangelism, the burning in the bosom, as they call it. We make an attempt to avoid that. So we're trying to defend an historic objective truth. And in doing that, you're certainly right. We kind of get pushed into appealing to more reason, ration, logic, empiricism, like finding ourselves going through that. So your question is very well stated in the idea of evangelizing and evangelizing a different worldview. I'm not promoting myself. It's not true because I say it's true. It's true whether I believe it or not, kind of thing. You see what I'm saying? So yeah, it does make it difficult.
So I understand that pursuit, but here's where I have a question for Ned, because Ned and I are very much on the same page about so many things. But I want to ask him, so on a deeper level, so I'm going to explain from my perspective, Ned, and I want you to kind of riff off of what I say. From my perspective, humans make decisions mostly affectively and then have a post hoc rationalization for it. Because Christians are humans, they're doing the very same thing that I'm doing as a non-Christian. What does that say for a position that tries to distinguish humans A from humans B about their beliefs, considering that all of our decisions as humans have this path? Does that question kind of make sense for you, Ned?
Yeah. I mean, I think I get it. Yeah. And again, I think that it boils down to what is the result or what's the consequence of believing that way? There are, and again, we're getting in trouble for this because admitting that the truth is, a bad thing is on both sides if you're dogmatic. So from the atheist perspective, saying that there's good things in Christianity or religion in general, I'm like, you're not, I'm kicked out of the atheist club now. Yay. Anyway.
and in your atheist club.
Exactly. But if you're honest, you have to admit that, yes, there are some benefits to believing in a deity, regardless what that deity is. So how do you get there? I mean, if what you're saying is correct and everything is, and so I'll rephrase it, and if I'm off, let me know. But the way that I'm, I guess, envisioning what you're saying is our initial decision stems from an emotional driver. And then after we have committed to that, now we're going to post hoc rationalize that based on maybe some irrational things, but we're going to defend that.
The rationalization may or may not be right. And all of this happens below the level of consciousness.
Right, exactly. And it, again, it's emotional driver. And we can get into why, especially, I think one of the biggest problems, at least from what I've seen from an educator standpoint, and I guess post public school educator, is the problem with why we have that inherent negative connotation with being wrong and that negative driver, and we don't want to be wrong. But anyway, I don't want to get into that because that's a big rabbit hole.
No, actually, it taps exactly into the topic, right? Because it feels bad. It's emotionally negative to feel wrong. Everybody wants to. If we're going to move towards positivity, we're going to be right all the time, and we're going to be the most damaged, unprepared person to deal with reality ever.
But see, in my opinion, it should be the absolute opposite. Being wrong should be something, and to be honest, I mean, the more I think about this, and I meant to say this earlier, going back to the homosexual deal with my dad, that pleasure that I got from that just fundamental change and going, wow, the light bulb just went off, eureka, whatever it is. I think I tend to chase that. I think that that's a lot of the reason that I think the way I do, because I want to feel that again, and that ground shaking, breaking all barriers, and my things just completely open up from that point. And, you know, to be honest, there have been smaller deals like that, but that one was big. Again, I'm going to get in trouble for mentioning this word. Dramagate was another one that was eye-opening to me, because at that point, I did think that atheists were more rational. They did think, and they would come to the realization of, hey, let's step back and see what's going on. And they were just as emotional, if not more so, than a lot of the religious end of it. So that was another one that I could have mentioned. But getting back to your point as far as
everyone's human. We all make decisions based on emotions and then post hoc rationalize them. Some of us call ourselves Christians. Some of us call ourselves atheists. Some of us call ourselves any other.
Well, I think you I think you began this and hit the nail on the head, and we kind of end up full circle here, is because, you know, my chocolate and vanilla analogy, you know, what's going to make you feel good and fulfilled throughout life may not be the same as Joe Schmo. So when they decide that they want to believe in Y, where we believe in X, I don't think it is as much about we've found what's true, in that what we look at as being true makes us whole, makes us feel content. And that was, and I'll stop there because that was where my question was going for the panel. But I hope that wrapped it up enough right there anyway.
I mean, yeah. I mean, unfortunately, I feel like this could go on for like another hour longer than was expected, because I would love to have Trey and Landon answer the same question, but I think that my time is up. I think that I've kind of overextended my welcome on this, on this version of the hangout.
We're usually okay with some rabbit trails and whatnot, but yeah, for the viewers, typically when you get around the time period we are, it's hard to stay in there. So, you know, yeah, thank you for the restraint, Chris. Ned, we'll move to you, buddy. Do you have a question for the Christians that you would want answered?
I mean, it's specifically me to you guys, but I think anybody, including anybody watching, the thing that I think I struggle with more than anything is trying to divorce myself from the emotions. And number one, at least acknowledging, if not identifying, what emotions are tied to these questions. But more importantly is asking yourself, and this is the question, is how would it affect you just imagining that whatever you believe is wrong? What emotions does that bring up? What gut, you know? And I guess the best way to I don't know, if I found out that my daughter was gay and was in love with her best friend, it wouldn't affect me hardly at all. I mean, I wouldn't, I'd be happy for her. She had found somebody she loves, not a big deal. If I found out my wife was gay and had a lover, that would devastate me, regardless if it was male or female. And it doesn't matter. And would I want to know that? I don't know. Am I purposely avoiding some information out there that would lead me in the direction of finding out something that I don't want to know? And I've got an analogy with my grandmother, but I don't want to go in that rabbit hole. But I guess the question is, and I don't even know if you can answer it off the top. It may be something you have to kind of chew on for a while. But if you were faced with the facts that your worldview, and Chris, you're invited to answer this too, what emotions does that bring up when you think that way? I mean, is it good? Is it bad? Is it indifferent? What does it do to you guys?
Now, when you say my worldview is wrong, does that mean to the default position of atheism, or you want it so broad, like, no, I actually find that the Bhagavad Gitas are very compelling, and I want the 330 million gods of Hinduism? Right.
Either. I mean, I kind of like it open without constraint. I mean, if there's one end of it, let's say where the Bhagavad Gita is either more appealing or let's say neutral, whereas atheism would be devastating. Mm-hmm. I find that kind of interesting there, or vice versa. If it has to be Christianity, specifically your version, and Christ as you believe him to be, or kind of an all or nothing proposition, everything else is devastating. That also is interesting. So I'd open it up, just how does it, or if there is a spectrum, just kind of from there.
Okay, go ahead, Trey, and then I'll answer.
Well, it's interesting. We all have experienced, dramatic changes in our worldview, but specifically, especially around the Christian worldview, and how we view, or like myself and Landon would view Jesus Christ. That would be fairly catastrophic. Like most famous Christian scholars, if everything is true about Jesus, it is of the utmost importance. If it's all a lie, then then there is literally no significance. It would be challenging to rewrite your worldview in an empirical way to answer the basic questions emotionally that you would. All of a sudden, the personal nature of sin, you have to answer that question. The nature of repentance, you have to answer that question. I have to answer the question of justice, and I have to find a new empirical methodology with which to do it. It would be very challenging, and the hardest part is not just emotionally, but intellectually, because there's a certain point, especially when you're older, there's certain things that 2 + 2 actually equals 4, concepts that are kind of concrete in your mind that though that one has no particular value and importance, yet it displays the concreteness. And like you said, the value of the love you have for your wife, these are significant things. Imagine losing both your ability to view anything in this world rationally at the same time as losing the only hope for love that you have. That would be something very comparable to losing my worldview. Imagine losing the ability to rationalize, or as C.S. Lewis said, the light by which we see everything, by which everything becomes clear, and at the same time losing the compassion and love and just being left with yourself. At that point, I think that I would understand very specifically, I would understand the nature of the initial atheists, your Friedrich Nietzsche and the like, who they weren't anti-theists the way they are now. They were, God is dead theists of their time period. Atheism is very different back then versus it was now. They would have been not just philosophers, but a conceptual theologian, and the God is dead mentality. I would have a very distinct view of that, and what they talk about with the welcoming of suicide and death. I think that would be a very realistic representation of the experience that would be with my worldview being removed from me.
Yeah, kind of the quick and dirty on my end. I'd probably just paste brain matter all over this wall, to be honest. And then, same with that caveat that all of the significant questions were shored up, meaning I had zero kind of doubt or significant doubt in pure atheism, that there was an explanatory model that explained all known phenomena, so on and so forth, and all that was shored up. Yeah, I've officially lost any reason to live if there's no perpetuity to the individual. I might fly to Vegas and buy a bag of cocaine and some hookers first before I ended it. I would just pump as much dopamine as is possible, just go on a pleasure rush and just go to sleep and never wake up. I resonated with those quotes because that was my thought as an atheist. So yeah, to go from Christianity to pure atheism would kind of just destroy everything in that sense. It'd be very radical. Doesn't make it true just because I want it to be true. I understand that. Well, as far as degrading to another religion, real quick, Ned, and then I'll let you jump in. It just depends on which religion. Buddhism is unsatisfying because it's non-theistic, so there would be, it's kind of the same thing. As far as Islam, it's a lot more ethnocentric than they promote. So I don't fit in anyway. I'm too Cherokee and British for that. So that's not going to work for me. And in terms of Hinduism, again, it's difficult to get around that caste system. It's very inhumane in terms of its moral approach. To treat a segment of humanity worse than rats is a pretty miserable moral system and moral framework. So I don't really trust. I don't know what religion I would fall into if I, kind of left the Judeo-Christian claims. So I can't really answer for other religions. It was part of my search in agnosticism to find the other religions so unsatisfying on numerous grounds. And just to mention Judaism, they don't have a temple, so there's no kind of atonement for sin anymore. So yeah, in regards to religion, and then with pure atheism. So that's me.
And I mean, I guess to springboard on that, that would, from a personal perspective, it would, I don't know, it would worry me, and especially like the way that you speak, Trey. It's almost a self-preservation thing at this point that, you need it to be true to literally take another breath, it almost sounds like. And I'm very hesitant to go here because I'm kind of, I don't like to pick at things. And
Ned, you ain't going to cause anybody to die. I mean, if we were going to kill ourselves, we'd do it anyway, whether you caused it or not. And point one, and point two, if you buy into your atheism, it really doesn't matter anyway. Everybody's going to go to sleep. No,
but again, that's, and we can get into that. I mean, and maybe we do a moral one down the rail, but just because, I do care for you. I consider you.
No, I wasn't saying that. No. Yeah, no, buddy. I wasn't saying that at all. I was just saying, in an ultimate sense, I'm not saying you wouldn't be sorrowful or you wouldn't feel a sense of, let's just say you were tearing apart an argument so well.
He's offering a reductio. It's a reductio, taking it to its logical extension.
Yeah.
So,
but anyway, what I'm saying is that since it seems to be even to the point of self-preservation at this point, does that give you any pause for your certainty? Does that make it, I know how vested I am and how important this is literally to your existence, that in the same way that, I may not be looking at certain facts because I don't want to find out what's at the end of that rabbit hole. Do you think that because you're so vested?
No, I can answer that. I mean, you don't even have to qualify anymore. Just flat out, from my perspective, Ned, it's a fluctuation. Some days, and it's in that PBS special, Winifred Gallagher kind of says it this way. Some days I wake up and I can storm the gates of hell with a squirt gun, and other days I wake up and I wonder, I may not believe so much. I wonder, am I forgiven? Does God really have me in his mind? There could be days I wake up and it's like, I really do just want to go to sleep and there be nothing and not wake up again. So, it's not as though it's this bulldog certainty. Like I said, it would have to shore up a lot of things. Number one, you'd have to really deconstruct everything that's been built up, because I have committed myself and the way that I live my life, try to love my wife, try to love and raise and nourish my children based on this worldview. So yes, to disrupt that is going to cause some shifts, but it's not to say that I'm this big stalwart of faith. I'm far too evil and sinful for that. So, yeah, there's certainly fluctuations there, but the thought of just going to sleep and never waking up, I mean, I don't know. There's nothing horrible about that in a sense, if it could be proven true.
Okay. And I mean, I think that, it might springboard well into this if we want to do another discussion, whenever you guys want to get together on purpose. And, Christopher, maybe the same panel, or, whoever else wants to jump in, but because I think as interesting it is, at least for me, to see how other people come to understand things and rationalize and believe in things that are completely contrary to what I believe. I think from your perspective, trying to understand how I can see purpose in my life, knowing that inevitably everything is going to die, either the big crunch or, the heat death of the universe, how I can still go on and have an enjoyable and purposeful life. Kind of contrasting those two worldviews and seeing how we derive purpose from opposite ends of the spectrum, that might be interesting to ferret out too.
Sure. Yeah, not to bog this down, but yeah, I would be open to that. Trey, and I didn't know, buddy, I didn't mean to take so much time. I didn't know if you wanted to contribute to what Ned was saying.
And I also cut Chris off if he wanted to say anything too. So sorry, Chris.
Yeah.
It's actually it's very interesting. I'm actually a huge literary fan. I like a lot of what Oscar Wilde wrote. In particular, he was a very gifted author. Really represented secular humanism in a very unique light. But it's one of those things where I understand a lot of the secular humanism concept from some of its more gifted authors. But I will say this, there is an understanding, we obviously go through personal trials of faith as well, but there is an understanding that when you have a worldview and when you've expressed that worldview and where you've invested the time into a comprehensive understanding, there's aspects that, you will consistently change, by comparison. But to sacrifice the entirety of your worldview, how I view the laws of logic would be another good analogy equivalent. Imagine if I sacrificed all those and I just became a postmodernist. Well, my life would be very different than, and those are just three simple premises that I use for my life. So those three simple premises I sacrifice, it creates a radical transformation in my life to postmodernism. Imagine not just a couple of premises that are essential for all rational logical discourse, but imagine every single premises that you have built your entire life and understanding on, and the consequences thereof. The logical flow that you've gotten, the relationships you have, the passions that you have, all of them are very well tied into the premises that you are most convicted by. So you're actually right to what you were asking. Is it can actually have catastrophic effects. Although, to be honest, from my friends who are atheists, and I'm certain Landon could speak to this as well, who have had that happen to them, the radical transformation change, it's the transformation of the Christian faith is impactful in that way, because you are rejecting specific premises that you've lived your life by at a point and completely changing the framework with which you will live the rest of your life. So, I imagine that could be emotionally catastrophic to anybody, the kind of change that you're talking about. It's just that obviously some premises we hold to more dearly than others.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Trey. Now, Chris, did you want to jump in on the same question, bud?
The only thing I wanted to contribute was something that Ned was getting towards when he was talking to you, Landon. And it really has to do with investment, right? Depending on how invested you are in certain dictates of your worldview, when they are shown to be wrong, that's going to scale with your investment in the things that you thought were true that have been shown to be wrong, right? If you have a worldview that manifests as things are provisional and I'm happy to change how I think and what I believe and how I'm willing to build this model and project it into reality based on the information that's given to me, well then, given new information, that's not really a problem. From a secular humanist, from a atheistic perspective, when you're looking for absolutes and you think that, there are things outside of you that are certain, you are way more invested than somebody with the previous worldview, which is more provisional. So bottom line is, if I'm going to put this on a bumper sticker, the amount of emotional negativity that you have with understanding that your worldview is wrong has everything to do with your investment with the tenets of that worldview.
Yeah, well, and sort of to add a little bit of substance to that, Chris and Ned, is Mike Shermer was quoted by Richard Dawkins in his God Delusion of, he seems to give this thing where he says kind of this very question, what would be different about your life if you became an atheist? And if you say, I basically live the same way in terms of morals, then what good is religion? And then he asks, well, I'd become a thief, a murderer, whatever. And then he says, well, then you're just showing you're actually an evil person anyway. Right. And I think he sets up a false dichotomy there. What I would push back on Mike Shermer on that is, I would contend that from a Judeo-Christian worldview perspective, you can't really say what evil is. You could say, preference, or you could say that's not necessarily considerate of another person or what have you, but you certainly couldn't call something evil in that sense. And I would say, yeah, it does have dire consequences in that, it's not just what somebody does, but there is a motivation behind it as well, to have genuine compassion for my neighbor. The fact that one can experience and have an identity grounded in the eternal God, creator of all things. And that frees me then to love and serve and have compassion upon my neighbor is sort of a motivating factor behind that. That's intrinsic in the Christian doctrine of vocation. We're working to serve our neighbor because everything vertically has been satisfied by Christ. So that's why, for the most part, a Reformation Christian repudiates those forms of Pelagianism or a hardline Wesleyanism that focuses on good deeds as, quote, earning ways to heaven. That's not possible. We see God's holiness and justice as perfect and infinite. We're unable to do that. Only Christ can mitigate that. So because Christ has established the relationship between man and God, the person to person, or to speak Christianese, the first table decalogue is satisfied in Christ. The second table decalogue, person to person, we are now free to exercise that. So it isn't just the actions, it is the motivation behind it. Because we've experienced infinite love that way, we're free to express that out. So I think Dr. Sherman, I'm not saying you were saying that, Chris, at all. I was just simply illustrating Mike Shermer because he's been a topic of our discussion tonight. And Richard Dawkins, kind of highlighted that in his book as a big thing, that, it's 6 1, half a dozen another. No matter what, we've got the religious person trapped when we say that, when we ask that question. If you wouldn't change, then it didn't mean anything. So what does it matter? Just get rid of it. Get rid of the, quote, superstition. If you would change, well, you're really an evil person anyway. So, what religion doesn't. And I'm just saying that's a false dichotomy. Like, it is significant and it does matter.
Well, but I think the other thing that ignores is that there is value in assigning morals from an internal perspective instead of deriving your morals from, a God or anything external. They're internally driven, and that's where I get my morality. And yeah, there are tests that I've developed from an internal perspective that allow me to make these decisions. And I think that a lot of times when people have these external drivers, they either aren't aware that that's kind of where we get, or at least I get, my morals from, and that is a possibility. And there are some tests out there that, at least from my opinion, I mean, I can get a lot I can get a lot more accurate and more predictive modeling, if you will, of what, for lack of a better term, the oughts ought to be, even though I don't believe in an absolute ought. But you can see kind of where I'm going there is that it's not so much that what is the use? Why not just be an atheist? No, to me, from where I'm seeing, and again, it could be emotions that's driving this, I see it as it's a better way to do it. It's a more effective, and it enhances humanity if it becomes internal instead of external, if that makes any sense at all.
Sure.
Ned, allow me to, I just want to interject one thing, Ned. I would love to have a discussion with you at some point, because there are ways that you're using moral development language that are disturbing me.
Okay. Yeah, I'd definitely, that'd be fun. Yeah, I mean,
and by the way, I'm not chastising you. This is based on my limited understanding of something, and I'd love to bounce it off of you.
Yeah, anytime. Because again, I mean, I may be completely screwing this up, so let me know.
I don't think you screwed anything up. I would just like to know a little bit more about what you think in the way that you use the words that you use, because they might mean something different to me than they mean to you. And as soon as we figure that out, we'll be more on the same page.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool.
Okay. Now, Trey, I wanted to give you one last chance to ask the atheist a question, if you had one for him.
Sure. You know what, actually, since we're talking about Shermer, I always found it interesting how he viewed individual biases. It's a reality that, if it's one thing that is that's been consistent, the confirmation bias is just, it's intrinsic. It's one of those things where you look through your bookshelf, you'll notice that there's a significantly larger amount of your personal preference books versus people who would have an alternative perspective. I would ask this of both of you guys. How do you observe your confirmation bias, and what do you guys do to challenge it? Because I had to have my mind challenged externally before I even bothered to pursue any understanding beyond it to begin with.
I didn't know who wants to go first, Chris, you or me?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I was actually just writing down the questions, so I was able to answer them most appropriately. But I think I got it. So if you don't mind.
Yeah, jump in.
All right. So confirmation bias. Confirmation bias, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, is confirmation bias is when you view your environment, your antenna is most sensitive to the things that confirm the things that you already think. And it is the flip side of the coin of what's called disconfirmation bias, which is you're easy to view the things that disconfirm the things that you don't believe, right? So that's just a built-in part of human nature. And the people who expose this, or the people who popularize this, are Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. They actually won a Nobel Prize in economics for including a psychological component into economics, which was based on something called rational choice theory. So they do a wonderful job of demonstrating how psychology is really important in trying to give perspective on things where people have to behave 100% rationally. And if people behaved 100% rationally, then economics would not have error bars. Everybody would think like an economist, homo economicus, and economies would be fluid in a way that they're not right now. The reason why they're not is explained by psychology, and these biases and heuristics is a weird word for mental shortcuts, that it's built into human beings. We're really good at being rational when it comes to day-to-day events. We stop at stop signs, we stop at red lights, we go at green lights, we don't run over people that are crossing the street. Like, we are rational and reasonable in day-to-day events. But we're predictably irrational when it comes to having intuitive decisions about more complex ideas. That's the confirmation bias that Trey is talking about. So how do I view my own confirmation bias? I try to engage in a Buddhist philosophy of mindfulness and centeredness, and knowing that I am biased. I can't get away from the fact that I'm biased because I'm a human being. And part of my belief set, part of what I think I know, is that humans have this disconfirmation bias, as well as a bunch of heuristics. So I just try to be mindful of it as far as how it interferes or interacts with my social communications, because once again, as a human being, social interactions are one of the most important parts of my day. So how do I challenge my confirmation bias? I challenge my confirmation bias by having civil and respectful conversations with people whose opinions I disagree with, giving them a principle of charitability, accepting that they will think differently than me, and being curious about what they think and how they think. And as a demonstration of that, I used to host a show or a hangout, whatever you want to call it, online called Meeting of the Minds, where I purposely invited people that I disagreed with onto my show so that we could have a discussion and show via demonstration, lead by example, that we can disagree without being disagreeable. Disagreeing without being disagreeable is how I challenge my confirmation bias.
That's excellent. Just love that explanation.
Thank you.
Ned, you're up, buddy.
All right, I'll springboard off of that. I'm probably not going to do nearly as good of a job, but I'll see if I can add anything to it. I mirror a lot what Christopher said. I mean, I literally enjoy these conversations. I mean, well, you know for sure, Landon. Me and you have private conversations. I mean, I like doing this. It's fun to try to dig and figure things out. You know, I'll take it past even confirmation bias, and Dunning-Kruger, I think, is huge in that. And what Dunning-Kruger is that the people who are more certain tend to be the people that are less educated in whatever field you're talking about. So if you go and you say, you know, how does a jet engine work? You know, someone who builds jet engines or designs jet engines are going to say, well, I'm pretty sure, and we've got a pretty good handle on what's going on. Whereas the layman's probably going, oh, I know it sucks, squeeze, bang, blow, goes, you know, I mean, we'll go into it and be almost cocksure they know everything about it. Maybe not to that extreme, but it tends to go that way. Therefore, I understand that, number one, I have a vested interest, like it or not, in what I believe to be true. So I need to educate myself to the opposite, to, okay, what does the contrary position believe, and why do they believe it? And then take it to the point of, I like the Socratic method a lot. So my method is I want to grant all of it. I want to try to say, okay, everything that is being posited here is true. What problems or what would happen if that is the case? And if I can find stuff that there's not problems with, that, look, this works and this makes things a lot better than what I thought reality was, I hopefully will force myself into a position to where I've got to start to accept that as real and as something that is more legitimate than what I believed before.
Outstanding. Well, I'd like to thank, obviously, Christopher, Ned, Trey, Phil. Thank you so much for hosting and running this. Thank everybody for watching. I hope this was incredibly informative and beneficial, whether you're a Christian or a secular atheist, humanist, or somewhere in between. Hopefully this conversation was stimulating, challenging, encouraging. Well, hopefully everybody enjoyed that dialogue. Please feel free to leave comments at the bottom and some of your thoughts, some challenging questions that hopefully we can interact with. And if you have any show ideas, as you've seen our YouTube page and looked at some of the discussions we have, what's something that you would like to see if you're a personal friend?